And welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and these are the best commander cards from Stronghold. So I'm going through all of the old sets, pulling out the 10 best cards for commander from each set, and it's really interesting when you go back and look at these because you're like, oh yeah, that card come from that set originally. There's not going to be a lot of shocking cards that I mentioned in this series that you guys are never going to have heard of before. They're mostly going to be commander staples, but I think it's really interesting to see where some of these commander staples originated from. So I'm going to start out with an honorable mention, and it's going to be Mox Diamond. And I wasn't sure exactly how to deal with this one. This could have been number one on the list, I guess. It's an incredibly powerful card. It is used mostly in CEDH. I don't know how often this is used in a casual game. It's like a $700 card. I thought that I would at least give it a mention. Obviously, people are aware of its existence and it is used in certain situations. So I do have to give it a mention, or people will probably wonder why I didn't. I think some people might not even consider this to be a casual card. I don't know. I won't get into that debate here, but certainly I got to say something about it. Coming in at number 10 is Awakening. 2 green enchantment at the beginning of each upkeep. Untap all creatures and lands. This is just such a powerful effect, and interestingly enough, in this list there's a bunch of these really powerful universal effects. They made a lot of cards like this back in the day, and I love cards like this because it's helping everybody, but of course you're going to break symmetry. You're going to use it so that it works better for you with whatever you're doing in your deck, and being able to untap all creatures and lands at the beginning of each upkeep, of course, you can do a lot of busted things with that, and it can work really well in a lot of decks. Coming in at number 9, Intruder Alarm. 2 and a blue enchantment. Creatures don't untap during their controller's untap step. However, whenever a creature enters the battlefield, untap all creatures. So again, another one of these universal effects that's going to be affecting everybody, but you're going to be taking advantage of it. Of course, this is a very combo crazy card. A lot of ways to go infinite with this guy. Just really one of the most infamous combo cards throughout the history of the game. So I got to give it a mention. It does get used a lot in commander decks. Other than the infinite part though, you can also use this in the same way that you would use an Awakening though, right? Where you want your stuff to be untapping on everyone's turn. So all they have to do is just play a creature on their turn and all your stuff is going to untap so that you can do some more shenanigans with it, right? So it can also work in that scenario as well. Really, really powerful effect. Coming in at number 8, Horn of Greed. 3 mana artifact. Whenever a player plays a land, that player draws a card. So the trifecta here of these symmetrical universal effects that are going to be affecting everybody, but of course you're going to use it to benefit yourself more, most notably in a lands deck, right? And the important wording here, of course, is whenever a player plays a land. So this has to be the land you play for turn, right? If you cast a ramp spell, like a rampant growth, you throw that land into play, you're putting onto the battlefield, but you are not playing it. So Horn of Greed will only trigger if you play your land for turn. So of course it's extra good in those decks where you can play more than one land each turn, right? Those are the decks that are going to want to use this. Like that Azusa deck, for example, right? You can play 3 lands per turn, and every time you play that land, you're going to be drawing a card off of it. So it's extra bonkers in decks like that. Coming in at number 7 is Fling. That's right. This is where this spell originated from for all those who don't know. And that's why I think it's funny to go through these lists, because you get to see where all of these really popular effects originated from. 1 in a red instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. Fling deals damage equal to the sacrifice creature's power to any target. So this is the original Fling spell. Obviously, that's why the term is called Fling. There's lots of other effects that have been printed throughout the history of the game since then, but this is the OG, and of course it does get used in a lot of strategies. Fling effects in general I think are just great in any deck, because if you have a creature and your opponent's about to kill it, in response you can just fling it at a target, get some value off of it because it's going to die anyway. But of course, particularly in that deck where you want to be flinging your creatures, get that giant commander that you can just one-shot your opponents by doing damage to it with. Not commander damage, but there are a lot of decks out there that can just close out the game with a card like this. Coming in at number 6, Ensnaring Bridge. 3 mana artifact. Creatures with power greater than the number of cards in your hand can't attack. So again, this is another one of those effects that's sort of universal, right? Obviously it works on you as well as your opponents. However, this is not as symmetrical because it counts the number of cards only in your hand. And of course, that's really easy for you to control. Another card that is sort of infamous throughout the history of the game because there's a lot of ways you can really lock your opponents out of attacking. Really great in any deck where you have a really low powered creatures, even 0 power creatures, right? If you're in like that walls deck where you have a lot of 0 power walls that you can attack with, you can have 0 cards in hand and still attack with your creatures, and your opponents won't be able to attack at all, right? You can really lock them out. I did the same thing in my goat tribal deck because those goat tokens are O1s. So the strategy I used there worked really well with Ensnaring Bridge, where I could attack with my goats and then pump them up and nobody else could attack. But of course, if you just want to completely lock everyone out of attacking, it's also great. Can be good if you just want to keep big creatures from attacking and you don't mind the small ones. But if you're in a really heavy pillow fort effect and you don't want anyone to be attacking at all, this is really one of the best options for you. Speaking of shutting down those combats, coming in at number 5, Constant Mists. That's right, everyone's favorite repeatable fog, 1 in a green instant, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. But of course, it also has buyback, sacrifice a land. And of course, again, in those lands decks, you could just probably keep doing this forever. Gets a little annoying. Yes, I know it's not the funnest card ever. In fact, there's a few cards on this list that I'm sure people are cringing when I mention them, but it is obviously a very powerful effect and gets used in a lot of decks, particularly those lands decks. Really the best fog effect ever in the history of the game, I think. Coming in at number 4, Heartstone, 3 mana artifact. Activated abilities of creatures cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana. So again, another card that I'm sure everyone's seen in a commander game before. It was a really unique effect when it first came out. It was the only card that did this. We've gotten a few more throughout the history of the game, like Zerta and stuff like that, that will reduce the cost of activated abilities. However, this is the only colorless option, right? If you're in any deck where particularly your commander has an activated ability where you want to be reusing it over and over and over again, and there are a ton of commanders that are doing that, this gets included in a lot of those decks. Just reducing it by 1 means you can probably use it a lot more in a turn than you would normally. So that's why I got this guy so high on the list, because it does go in a lot of commander decks. Coming in at number 3, Burgeoning. 1 green mana enchantment. Whenever an opponent plays a land, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So of course, I think probably everyone's seen this card before as well. Originated from Stronghold. And again, another lands themed card. Not sure if that's a coincidence here or not, but again, another staple for all those lands decks. This really is one of the best ways to get lands from your hand onto the battlefield. I guess maybe the best, right? Because of course, your opponents are going to be playing lands. Again, though, the wording here is whenever an opponent plays a land. So if they rampant growth, this will do nothing. It has to be the land they're playing for turn. But of course, all the people that have seen this in action, turn 1, I play a Burgeoning, and then my opponent plays their land for turn, I put a land into play. Next opponent plays their land for turn, I put a land into play. By the time I get around back to my turn, I already have 4 lands in play. It is probably one of the best ways in the history of the game, at least in Commander, to ramp right out of the gate if you can get this thing on turn 1, and of course have a lot of lands in your hand. A lot of times though, this will be a card that you will play turn 1, and I've seen this a bunch. You'll get a couple lands out of your hand really fast, and then it just sits there and does nothing for the rest of the game. I think this card is particularly good if you are in a theme where you are picking up lands. So if you're in a landfall theme where you're picking up your lands so that they're back in your hand, so that when your opponent plays a land, you get that landfall. Also is great for, I want to get a landfall trigger on my opponent's turn. There's a particular reason you want to be doing that, right? But obviously a really powerful card, one of the best ramping cards in the history of the game, I think. Coming in at number 2, Evacuation, 3 blue instant. Return all creatures to owner's hands. And I'm sure people will think I have this way higher on the list than I should, because there's probably a lot more traditionally powerful cards lower on the list. For me, I have this at number 2 because again, we're talking about Commander. This is not the most powerful cards from Stronghold. In the Commander format, this card gets used a ton. It's been reprinted a ton. It's used in a lot of different formats. It's just a universally good card. Instant speed, I return all creatures to owner's hand. That saved my bacon more times than I can count. Whenever your opponent swings all out with that Crater Hoof attack or any really big attack, just 5 mana saves your life and then returns every other creature to hand. Works really good in a deck where maybe you want to be returning your creatures to hand. Like in my Tashana deck, I have a lot of ETB creatures, so I have no problem returning my creatures to hand. Play my Eternal Witness again? Sure, why not? So it can be extra good there, but particularly in that mono blue deck. And again, this is why I give this a lot higher of a rating than maybe some people would, because it is an answer in a particular color, right? Mono blue doesn't deal with go wide strategies very well, or just dealing with lots of creatures in general. It doesn't really have any board wipes. So in a mono blue deck, this is pretty much an auto include, because you have to be able to deal with all your opponents having lots of creatures. And this is one of the only ways in mono blue to do that, right? Really, really great card, I think. But coming in at number 1, everyone's favorite. And it's amazing how many cards on this list that people are going to see and go, oh, that card, ugh. Grave Pact, 1 black, black, black enchantment. Whenever a creature you control dies, each other player sacrifices a creature. And again, this is where this card originated, everybody, in case you didn't know, known as a Grave Pact effect, right? There's other effects that have been printed afterwards that do this. This is the OG. Of course, everyone loves it in that sacrifice theme where all your opponent has to do is start sacrificing their creatures, and then you have to do it as well. It's a rough one, for sure. This is a really tough card once your opponent gets it on the battlefield, especially if you don't have a lot of creatures, because then you're just going to have to sacrifice all of them, probably including your commander. It's almost a little bit of a stacksy piece in a way. It's not the funnest card to play against. It is obviously incredibly good in a commander game, particularly because you have more than one opponent, right? If you just have one opponent, then you're only making one guy sacrifice their creatures. In a commander game, every time you lose a creature, all 3 of your opponents have to sacrifice a creature as well. That's incredible value. It's so good in so many strategies. It's an incredibly powerful effect. Of course, I got to put it at number 1. I don't know what else people think could go over this at the number 1 spot. For me, this is for sure number 1 from the Stronghold set in Commander. But that is it. What did I miss? What would you guys have put maybe a little higher? There are a few cards that I can kind of think of that almost made the list. These are the ones, again, you know, a card like Fling or Constant Mist, people wouldn't typically think of, but those are Commander staples. Those are Commander cards that you do see all over the place that get played in a lot of strategies, right? So that's why I like to include cards like that on this list. This isn't just the most powerful cards from Stronghold, it's the cards that get played in Commander a lot. But that is my list. Let me know in the comments below what you think, but that is it for today, and thanks for tuning in.